All right, well, good evening and welcome, everybody. Today's March 14th, 2023, and I want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today. I'm Phil Santonzi, Program Chair for Section ASQ 1510, Southeast Florida. If you want to know more about ASQ, Section 1510, of course, you can always check our Communities tab on the myasq.org website, or you can join our LinkedIn group. So this event is being recorded and it'll be uploaded within a few days to the 1510 YouTube channel. And it'll have the link also for the presentation. Tonight's speaker is Mercedes Massana, CEO of MDM Engineering Consultants. She has over 35 years of experience in the medical device industry. She founded MDM Engineering Consultants, providing engineering and quality consulting services in the medical device, biotech, and pharmaceutical industries. She works with medical device companies to help develop and release products within the constraints of FDA, ISO quality systems, with focus on systems engineering and risk management. Mercedes is a former member of the ASQ 1510 board, as well as an ASQ certified biomedical auditor, software quality engineer, quality manager, quality auditor, International Council on Systems Engineering certified systems engineering professional, and as a regulatory affairs professional, Society RAPS devices certified. Tonight, Mercedes is going to tell us about integrated risk management for medical devices. So please join me in welcoming Mercedes.
So first I want to say the risk management, we're going to talk about medical devices here, but it really applies to any industry, right? You have to perform aerospace, anything, risk management. You have to perform risk management. Tonight, first we're going to talk a little bit about risk management basics to get everybody on the same page and learn the terminology. Then we'll talk about what a risk management process looks like. We'll go into some risk management tools. And lastly, we'll talk about risk management in post-production risk management and how we integrate risk management into pretty much everything we do. So risk management is the application of management policies, procedures, and practices to the task of analyzing, evaluating, controlling, and monitoring risk. So all medical devices, in fact, pretty much all products carry some level of risk. So you very rarely, not ever, reduce risk totally. When we look at risk management, we have to consider who the risk applies to, right? It's not just for medical devices, you would think the patient, but you have to think of operators, right? The clinicians, the nurses, bystanders, the people that service the instruments, right? So even the environment, you have to consider improper. So you have to consider anything that a risk, that you can pose a risk to. And then risk management, there's no clear-cut defined thing that says, oh, this is acceptable and this is not acceptable, right? It's up to the manufacturer to determine the level of risk that they feel comfortable. Now, there are regulatory agencies, right, that won't let you release a device that's not safe or at least state-of-the-art as compared to other devices. But really, it is up to the manufacturer to determine how safe the device is. For example, at one point in my career, I worked on a dialysis machine for third world countries, peritoneal dialysis. And it was intended for India and for China, but in that was like 20 years ago. They didn't have that therapy available because it was too expensive. So we were trying to limit the cost of the daily cost of the therapy to a certain value, right, that could be afforded by the people we were intending to have use the device. At the end, we actually couldn't release the product because we couldn't make it safe enough for that amount of money, right, that therapy cost. So we decided to scrap the product. We didn't want to release a less safe product for third world countries, right? And a safer product like for the US and Europe. It just wasn't what the company stood for. So we scrapped it. But it is up to the manufacturer to determine how safe it is. So why do we perform risk management? So medical device companies, they invest a lot of money into risk management. A lot of it is to ensure that we have safe device, right? That we can identify potential safety issues early, that we encourage and start thinking about defect prevention early on in the design, so that we don't have safety-related issues in the field, right? Having safety-related issues in the field can cost you your brand name, right? It could be associated with a negative act. It can cause liability suit, so you can lose a lot of money there. And you have to also have a risk management process in order to demonstrate adequacy to regulatory bodies. Medical devices, there is one particular standard, ISO 14971-2019, which is recognized by FDA, and pretty much if you're going to sell products in the US or in Europe, you're going to be using the standard. Pretty much anywhere in the world, the standard is recognized. That standard is referenced by other standards, including some of the FDA guidance documents, and by different IEC standards that apply to medical. In fact, in ISO 13485-2016, this is the quality management systems for medical devices, it mentions risk 15 times. So they want you to consider risk in pretty much everything you do. Supplier controls, for verification, validation, for testing, for in CAPAs and training, even in product plans. So they want you to consider risks pretty much in everything that you do. So one thing with risk management, and I know we just saw Bob's presentation, right, with mean time to failure. A lot of people sometimes want to do like FMEAs. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with FMEAs. I'll show you what one looks like in a little bit. But really, you have to do risk management at the system level, because only the system can cause harm, right? So if you have like an infusion pump, you're going to have the actual pump, you're going to have the tubing set, right? The carries, then you're going to have the solution bag. You have to look at the totality of the system in order to mitigate risk at the system level. Now, you can look at the infusion pump itself and try to improve its reliability so it doesn't fail, right? But mitigating risk has to be done at the system level. And that's what we call top-down analysis as opposed to FMEA, which is more bottom-up. Okay, so risk management process has two major elements. It has risk assessments, where we perform risk analysis. In risk analysis, we identify hazards, and then we estimate the risk for each hazard. Risk evaluation determine if we need to control that risk. We evaluate the risk against our criteria and determine if we have to control the risk. And then the second part is risk control. And risk control is where we mitigate the risk down to an acceptable level. So the first thing with medical devices that you have to do is identify the intended use, right? In order to determine, well, what risks, what inherent risks exist for this intended use. So for example, the risk for a hemodialysis device as opposed to an infusion pump will be different. So I need to know what is the intended use of my device. Who is intended to use this device? Right? If it's going to be used on pediatric patients, you know, the severity of some of the risks might be a lot higher, right? Than if it's going to be used on, you know, normal, I guess, healthcare patients. But you have to determine who is the device going to be used for. The environment in which it's going to be used. So a device that's used in the hospital might be able to be a little bit more complex, right? Because you're relying on the expertise of the doctor and the nurse. A device used in the home has to be fail-safe, right? It has to be foolproof. If it's a device that's implanted, then obviously, like the pacemaker, reliability is going to be really important because you can't fix it. You know, it's a major thing to remove the device. So the environment in which it's going to be used is going to be very important. And then the characteristics of the typical users. Are they going to be, you know, PhDs? Are they going to be, have an 8th grade education? Are they going to be like diabetic users, might have some mobility issues or things like that? So we have to know all of that in order to identify a full set of hazards that relate to this device. So this diagram appears in ISO 14971, and it shows the different components of risk. So we start with a hazard, and that hazard will lead to a hazardous situation. That's when the user is exposed to that hazard. That hazardous situation can result in harm, and harm can have different severities. Okay? That can go from maybe just a little cut to death. It can have different severities of harm. risk has the severity of harm times the probability of occurrence. That's how we quantify risk. In the standard, it uses P1 and P2. P1 is the likelihood that the sequence of events that allows the hazard to result in the hazardous situation occurs, times, and then P2 is the likelihood that if the hazardous situation occurs, harm of a specific severity will result. That's P2. The probability of occurrence of harm is then P1 times P2. P1 is what we can control. We can mitigate things in the sequence of events to bring down the risk. P2 is kind of outside of our control. The hazardous situation has already occurred. So this will be more controlled by medical practice and things like that. All right, so what's a hazard? We want to identify known and foreseeable hazards associated with the medical device in both normal and fault conditions. So a hazard is something that can result in a hazardous situation that will result in harm. So in our example here, a shark is a hazard, right? It's only a hazardous situation if you're swimming in the water with a shark, but a shark is a hazard. In order to identify hazards, we need to know the intended use of the device and even possible non-intended uses, because sometimes people use things in ways they're not supposed to, and that can result in hazard. You want to look at historical data from other similar devices and try to learn from it, right? What caused issues with this device? You want to review clinical literature. You want to do things to identify hazards, like perform FMEAs, and HAZOP, and hazard analysis. And then there's a lot of times safety standards will tell you that for a particular thing, these are hazards that you have to be concerned. Right. So a hazardous situation is a circumstance in which people, property, or the environment are exposed to one or more hazards. So in this case here, we have a swimmer being exposed to a shark hazard. That's a hazardous situation. There's a probability that the shark would bite the swimmer, and that could result in different levels of harm, right? So there's that is the probability of harm. So different hazards, we can have, if I had a hazard that air in line, like for an infusion pump, the hazardous situation is that I infuse that air into the patient. That air might cause harm, or it might not. There's going to be a probability that it could cause an air embolism, for example, or maybe just pain. With an infusion pump, there's fluid, could be a hazard, and delivering too much or too little would be the hazardous situation, right? The patient gets either overdose. So harm is physical injury or damage to the health of people or property or the environment. So now if the shark attacks our swimmer here, different levels of harm can result. He might kill him. He might lose a leg or an arm, right? Or maybe it's just a bad cut where he needs a bunch of stitches. Or maybe it's just, a little infection and antibiotics. It doesn't require major intervention. So we estimate risk. That's the process used to assign values to the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. So here's where we estimate risk. Companies, and I'll show you example charts. Typically, people keep this pretty easy. It's like a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being the less severe, 5 being the most severe, 1 being the less likely, 5 being the most likely. Once we estimate risk and we evaluate that, we want to compare the estimated risk against a given criteria to determine if the risk is acceptable. So we estimate risk and then we say, okay, can I live with this risk or do I need to reduce? So this is an example severity table. So again, a severity of 1 would be something where it's negligible. A severity of 5 would be something that could result in immediate death or impairment. That would be something catastrophic, and everywhere in between. Most medical device companies use a scale of 1 to 5. Some use 1 to 10, but that's 1 to 5 is simple enough and works. So in our example here, if I had death as a possible consequence, that would be a severity 5. If I have bleeding only, that might be a severity 3. Right? So you could have a hazardous situation result in harms of different levels of severity. Now, P2 is how likely the hazardous situation is to to result in harm once it has occurred. So we're now swimming in the water with the shark. How likely is that to result in harm of the different levels of severity? That's our P2 value. And that's one of the components of the probability of occurrence of harm. That one we can control. Once you're swimming in the water with the shark, nothing is going to help you, right? At that point, it's just up to statistics whether you're going to get bitten or not, right? Now, the sequence of events, this is probably a term that maybe is not used in other industries, but in the medical device world, well, and probably in any industry, we want to understand the series of events that's required for the hazard to result in the hazardous situation. Sometimes there's multiple steps, right? So in an FMEA, typically you look at a single failure, right? When you're doing risk management, risk analysis at the system level, you can say, well, if A and B and C happens, then if that is a foreseeable thing, then I need to know, I want to look at that because I can mitigate at any step in that sequence, right? Or at every step in that sequence. So typically, if we use like FMEAs, fault trees, fish bones, we can identify different items that would lead to that hazardous situation. So that's how we identify our sequence of events. And now the P1, the likelihood that that sequence of events results in the hazardous situation, which is the second component of our probability of occurrence of harm, this is what we can affect, right? When we apply controls, we're reducing this probability that that sequence of events results in that hazardous situation. Right? And this is where we actually focus most of our attention with management. For probability of occurrence, typically use a scale of 1 to 5 again, with 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest, so the highest probability of it occurring. And a similar scale is used for P2, and then probability of harm against most manufacturers is have a lookup table. Typically, P2 only allows you to decrease P1. At the most, it allows you, again, the manufacturer would be responsible for setting up the table based on how much risk they're willing to accept. And then once we have our probability of harm and we have severity, now we can estimate our risk. So if I had a severity for harm that could occur, let's say occasionally, then my risk would be medium. Okay. Most manufacturers use a risk table like this. It doesn't really mean a heck of a lot in a sense, because the FDA doesn't really want you to have a lookup table that says, oh, I'm low, I'm good, I don't have to reduce my risk. In the medical device world, you want to reduce risk to as low as possible all the time, right? In fact, they took language out of the standard that used to say as long as it's technically and economically feasible. They really want you to reduce risk as much as possible. Obviously, there's still technical and economic constraints. Because if I could build an airplane that could survive a crash, but every seat on the plane would cost $1 million, nobody's going to fly my plane, pretty much, right? So I'm not really helping anything, right? If the cost is just prohibitive. So what we do with this is be able to prioritize how we look at risk and what we need to do to mitigate the risks. And then we do a risk-benefit analysis to determine if the risk is. When we're looking at risk controls, a lot of times, and if you've ever been in a brainstorming session for how can we reduce this risk, people will think of all kinds of things, right? At the end of the day, you have to look at it to say, well, you know, is this control worth it? Sometimes controls, especially like with alarms and things, can be a worse thing because there is like alarm fatigue. You have too many alarms in your instrument, right? The operators stop paying attention to the alarm, so it's like doing nothing. If you put too many components, it might be a reliability thing because now you have more parts that can fail. So you really have to evaluate all the potential controls and pick the ones that are most effective at mitigating. So risk control measures, once we look at risk control measures and say these are the ones we're going to implement, then we can re-estimate the risk, thinking the control measures are implemented appropriately. But those have to be verified and validated right before we can actually take credit for them. But we can re-estimate the risk to determine, yes, this is worth doing, and it gets the risk at the level that. So risks are rarely ever totally eliminated, right? We can reduce it, but we usually don't ever eliminate risk. So because there is some residual risk left, we have to determine if that residual risk is low enough for the product and for the risk that the manufacturer is willing to take. And residual risk have to be disclosed to the customer. Do that through labels. So an IFU for almost any product, right? You open the first page and there's 20, 50 warnings in there about things that could go wrong. Like don't put your radio in the bathtub, right? And things like that. Those are all risks that have to be disclosed to the user. So once I've done everything I can to lower the risk, I'm going to determine if I have an acceptable level of risk. And typically, I'm going to say my risk level is acceptable if I've complied with industry safety standards, right? If I have no single fault failures, so if I can detect failures and stop the therapy, or if I have some redundancy, right, so that not one little component failure will make my device not function properly. If it performs equivalent to similar devices, right, this is called state of the art. So for example, cars back in the 1960s didn't have seatbelts, right? Today, every car has a seatbelt. That has become state of the art. Airbags, right? That has become state of the art. With medical devices, it's pretty much the same thing. Once a company introduces a new feature that's considered safer, then in a few years, that'll be considered state of the art. And any new product would have to have those features. We want to know that risks have been reduced to the lowest level practical. And even though the standard doesn't say it, you're really going to take into account technical and economic feasibility. And lastly, the benefit has to outweigh the risk. So if there's a way that the patient can get the same benefit with less risk, then the benefits don't outweigh the risk. Right? So we want to do a risk-benefit analysis to ensure that the benefit of using our device outweighs the risk for the patient. And if we have unacceptable risk, then we either apply more controls to make it acceptable, or we abandon the design. Right, so risk-benefit analysis is, like I said, a way of looking at different things, the clinical benefit that's achieved through the use of the product, the safety requirements, and if there's other ways for the user to achieve that benefit without the same level of risk, with a lower level of risk. If our risk-benefit analysis says that the benefit of using our product is worth it, right, is better than the risk, then we can continue to use our product, even if we have high levels of risk, right? For some of these, like a ventilator, it might pose some risk, but if the next thing is, well, you can't survive, it keeps you alive at least, then that's going to be worth the risk if there's nothing else that would do the same function. For ISO 14971, the risk management report that summarizes everything that you did is an important tool and something that you use to show regulatory agencies that you do have a good risk management process, and then you follow that process in development of your product. And that's typically where you discuss your overall residual risk and your risk benefit. All right, so let's talk about some risk management tools. So we just said we're talking about the system level, right? The risk really has to be mitigated at the system level. So the system has different components, right? Like an infusion pump, have infusion pump and the tubing set that allows the medication to get to the user. Well, I'm going to mitigate at the system level because no matter what I do here, I might be able to reduce the likelihood that these items fail. But if they fail, I need to be able to keep my patients safe. right? So this might only fail 1 in a million times, but that one time it fails, I have to keep my patient safe at the system. And that's why hazards are mitigated at the system. Doing FMEA analysis will improve the reliability of the different components of the system so that you lower your P1, you lower the likelihood that this is going to fail. So I like to decompose my risk management activities, just like system architecture, right, where you decompose your system into different parts. I like to do the same type of decomposition with my risk management activities. So I have hazard analysis at the system level. I'll do FMEA of the different parts of the system, and then even components within that system, I can do FMEA. And then I can relate them all. So I can do a process FMEA of a part that I built, right? And I can link those end effects to the higher level. I can do subsystem FMEA and link those end effects to the causes in my FMEA. And the same, I can, the end effects of my FMEAs, I can link to my sequence of events in the hazard so that everything is related. So essentially, it's like your in your Windows, your file explorer, right? You click the plus, click on the plus, and you get all the files in there. Well, this is like saying, okay, here I identify all my faults at the system level, and then here I can be more specific and tell you, infusion pump, these failures will lead to this one hazard here. Right? And I can continue to drill down, and depending on the criticality of the system or the components, I could drill down as low as possible. Obviously, the more FMEAs that you do and the more you reduce failure modes, the better performance of your system, right, from a reliability standpoint. Fault trees is another tool that comes really handy in doing and identifying sequence of events. So for fault trees, you have a top level event, like in the diagram, and then you use and or gates to say, okay, what kinds of things need to happen for that top level event to occur. So you decompose it all the way to basic events, which are the little circles. So basically, we have our top event. We have an OR gate, so this event can occur or this event can occur and result in the top level event, right? An AND gate means that all events that are part of that AND gate would have to occur for that top level event. So an OR is either event, any of the events, and an AND gate is all of the events together have to occur. So this way you can again continue to decompose down to basic events that now you can mitigate. So hazard analysis is a little bit like an FMEA, but at the system level, right? And this is where we use the terminology of sequence of events and hazardous situations. And we try to identify anything that's foreseeable, right? Including foreseeable misuse at the system level that could result in hazard. Now, FMEA is typically a reliability tool, and it's used to improve the design reliability through detailed analysis of the system, subsystem, the component. You can do process FMEAs, or there are different types of FMEAs. And in an FMEA, you identify the failure modes and their effects on the system, and then you try to mitigate those failure modes. This can help you identify special or critical quality attributes or a device that then you can control through production, right, or through your supplier to ensure that those critical quality attributes are always met. So this is what typical FMEA looks like. You have an item and you define its function. Then you identify how that item can fail. So it's the no function, right? Partial function, degraded function, too much, too little function. Then you identify effect and the causes of those functions, the severity of that effect, the probability of the causes, and then how you can detect that cause or that failure and prevent the customer from seeing it. So that would be things like, final test and action, or it could be verification, things of that nature. Okay, then you can also have current design controls, like you might use a part that's a mill standard component or something that has a really low failure rate, and things like that. Those would be mitigations that the FME. And then once you do your mitigations, you reassess your severity and probability of occurrence and your ability to detect the failure to ensure that you reduce the likelihood of occurring. Okay, so Bob's presentation, right, talked about mean time to failure, which is reliability. And as I said earlier, a lot of people like to use FMEA as their risk analysis. But there are differences between risk and reliability. So for example, risk focuses on eliminating risks that can cause harm to the people or environment, where an FMEA focuses on preventing failures that can cause customer dissatisfaction, including those things that can lead to harm, but it's more on preventing failures. Sometimes hazards can be caused in normal circumstances, conditions, right? And you still need to be able to address this. The risk analysis covers intended and unintended uses, right? And it covers activities that can start prior to any design being available. But an FMEA is only valid once I have at least some level of design, because I need to know what my items are and what their function are and how they can fail. I can start a hazard analysis just by looking at the intended use, right, of what I'm going to have and having a very high level. In the hazard analysis, controls are applied at the system level. In an FMEA, you can apply controls at any level of the system. In the hazard analysis is where we make risk acceptability decisions. So in the regulatory environment, it's important to have risk acceptability in one place. Like I've seen manufacturers that make risk acceptability decisions in different FMEAs. Now you're trying to put it all together and go, well, what's this risk really? FMEAs come in a lot of different flavors. So you can have a design FMEA, you can have a risk use FMEA, which looks at the way that the user is going to interact with the product and determine ways that use errors can occur. So in the use FMEA, we analyze the task, who's doing the task, and how can the user fail to perform that task, correct? So a lot of times you hear the word user error. Well, in medical devices, you don't use user error. If the user makes an error, it's the manufacturer's fault, right? So we have to make things easy enough to use. That's why we call it use error. The FDA doesn't like the term user error because they will always blame the manufacturer. It's up to you. I mean, users can do pretty stupid things sometimes, but it's up to you to try to keep the user as safe as possible. There's software FMEAs where we look at software and the ways that software can fail. A little bit of different nuances with the software FMEA is that for software, there's really no probability of things occurring, right? Because software performs the same way all the time, unless you have some weird race condition or something like that. So if you have a fault in software, you're going to assume that it's always going to occur. Okay, so you don't calculate probability. And then risk controls for a software FMEA are really intended to build confidence that the software development process is robust. Unless you have like redundant processors, redundant algorithms, there's very little that you can do other than say, well, I'm using a 9062304 compliant process to develop software. Right? But you could always have like a monitor or a control that check on each other. I mean, that's a way of controlling software. Okay, so in the design FMEA, again, we look at parts and how the different items can fail. Design FMEAs are really useful if you're using a new part that you don't have any history on. If you're changing the application of something you're already using, you want to look at your design FMEA to make sure that it's still going to be fit for its intended function. And in an FMEA, you are analyzing single fault conditions. When you're doing it at the system level in a risk analysis, you're looking at a sequence of events. So it could be multiple things that could go wrong at one time. And then process FMEA, that's now in the manufacturing process, we want to see what the process can do to impact the device that we're manufacturing, right? And there are things like sterility, for example. If it's a sterile device that needs to be sterile, sterility can't really be checked, right? But we can put things in the process to ensure that the sterilizer works properly, but there are no tests for that. So if we didn't sterilize it properly, then our device could cause infection or things like that. So we want to look at the process, every step in the process, and determine how it can impact the operation of the device. Right, so once we've done all our risk work, right, we create a risk management file. So that risk management file is like the repository for all our FMEAs, all our risk analysis, our risk management report. We need to continue to look at our risk file and continue to update it based on design changes, right? If we're making a design change, we need to go back to our risk file. All of these are living documents, so we need to continue to maintain it. In manufacturing, right, if we change the process, we need to go look at the process FMEA, right? If we're driving control plans from the process FMEA, we need to go look at those. If there are changes, design changes, CAPA changes, they all need to go look at the risk management file and see what impact those changes can have. And then obviously any complaints, right, or service metrics, if we figure out that something keeps failing in the field and we need to replace it, we should be adjusting the probabilities, right, for our FMEAs and our hazard analysis based on all of the information that we have available to us. So the risk management documents are living documents. They continue to be updated till the product is obsolete, right, and no longer used. Again, a design change that could be driven either through, customer wants a new feature, something that we found in manufacturing, maybe some even cost cutting in manufacturing. We need to look at the design changes that would drive a new product, and then we would need to do our risk management activities throughout and continue to update our documents. So we never stop doing risk management on any product. Now, risk management is something that we do and is considered part of design, right? But it really informs or passes information on to everything else. So non-conformances, we can identify new hazards from non-conformance. Purchasing controls, we might have identified CQAs, right, or critical design outputs, critical components that we might have to impose some purchasing controls on. Design changes, we need to determine the impact of design changes and update our risk file if need be. Production and process control, right? We might identify new hazards through that, and we might need to impose new controls in production to reduce the likelihood of some hazards. CAPA. For CAPA, CAPA, usually you assign a risk level for the CAPA. We need to look at our risk analysis and determine the issue that can be caused and how high a level or how severity of that CAPA is. Complaints, that's an area that the FDA really looks at, right? And you need to go back to your risk file and show that you've addressed all of the root causes of those complaints. And then even in service, we might identify new hazards that we can go update our risk file. So pretty much everything that we do, right, everything revolves around risk. So any information we gain, we need to feed back into a risk file to make sure that they're updated and that our overall residual risk is still an acceptable level. So some of the things we can do with our risk file is we can use our FMEA to determine what our critical components are, right? And then put checks on those in the supplier. We can establish additional robustness criteria, right, in production for things that are critical to quality or essential critical components. We can use the design FMEAs and the process FMEAs to figure out where we need to establish process control plans. And then for corrective and preventive actions,
we need to start to look to make sure that any issues uncovered there that could lead to a hazard or harm are addressed in our documentation. And then this is somewhere where manufacturers get things often from that. Other things that you can do with the risk document, you can actually use field data to assign the probability, like P1. So if you have a granular enough detailed sequence of events and your complaint handling analyzes to root cause, you can map those so that then I can take field data and be able to estimate P1. It is the expectation of FDA that you are using field data at least to help you determine what P1 is. So purely quantitative P1 is hard to do. You have to have a really good description of complaints that most people don't have, but at least semi-quantitative, where you're analyzing that data and then you're using your expert judgment or your best judgment and what that P1 should be. I've actually helped people take their devices and designing, your error codes. Like you have a sophisticated device that comes up with error code E02. Well, you can map that code to your risk analysis and know, like, well, when I get E02, it means that this hazard could have occurred, or this hazard could occur. And then that helps you assess your complaints better, determine if you need a recall or whatever else you might need based on your risk file. So you can do a lot more than what's required and facilitate the use of data to inform your risk file. Right, so some of the issues that I see out there with manufacturers, the biggest issues with risk management is they have risk control that can be traced to requirements or to implementation, even if you didn't have requirements. So then you can't show evidence that you verified it or validated. So risk controls ideally should be traced, should drive requirements so that we know they're implemented in the design and we can verify and validate. Again, they don't demonstrate the effectiveness of the risk controls. I can say that anything can control a risk, but if I don't prove it, then I haven't done much. Then I use field data to update their P1 values. So the FDA, if you have a new product, you can release the product with a qualitative P1, right, which is based on subject matter expertise. But after a couple of years of having your product in the field, they're going to expect you to have some actual data that influences that P1 value. Again, when we have MDRs, we call them complaints, we need to make sure that those issues are covered in the risk file. And then you're expected to update your risk files periodically. So at least every 2 years, you need to go look at literature, go review things, go review your complaint, and make sure you update your risk file as needed based on the current information out there. So this is the typical verification validation B, right? So we have requirements in the slide. Typically, you will have like customer requirements or user needs, and you do use cases, system requirements, right? So we start elaborating on the design as we go. And then on this side of the V, testing at every level. Well, in that V, I like to put all of the risk documents in the middle of that V, because I take my intended uses that are typically documented in my user needs or customer requirements. That's going to drive the list of hazards that I'm going to have to worry about. Right? So I use those hazards for my system hazard analysis. That is going to drive, the risk controls are going to drive requirements, right? I'm going to go to architecture, and now I can start identifying the field functions for my FMEA. If my FMEAs, if I find something that can result in a hazard, it's going to inform my system hazard analysis, right? And I can do FMEAs at different levels. And then obviously any controls have to be validated or verified. So by putting that hazard, the risk documents in the middle, it actually integrates your entire development process. Ties everything together really, really well. And if you use a tool, like I'm using Doors or JAMA, you can do this all in a tool, so you have this level of traceability, which is really powerful in the audit. Any questions?
Yes, Hal.
Marcy, so the probability of occurrences are always a bit of a struggle for companies.
right? In the absence, if you have a predicate device and you have complaint data, of course, you can use that as information to come up with a P1, P2. But in the absence of that, if you have a new novel device, it's always a bit of a, or frankly, a guesswork, right?
It is.
What have you seen companies do out there to be able to put numbers that hopefully make sense? And then not only that, you come up with it once and then you put a risk control measure and then you have to decide how do you
evaluate.
improve that, but once again, it's a bit subjective.
So it is subjective, and initially with a new device, right, that you don't have data on or history on, you're going to be doing quality. So it's going to be kind of your best guess, let's just say. And that's going to be there. Now, as you start getting information, right, then you start evaluating, was this guess correct, right? And then after you have sufficient data, like a couple of years of data, then the expectation is that now you will use that data and go update on the device. Now, thing that some companies complicate their life. I know a company that actually takes the probabilities of the FMEAs and then they allocate a different percentage of this failure mode is going to lead to this hazard. So they do this allocation and then they assign P1 based on those FMEA values, which are subjective anyway. So it's like you're going through all this, jumping hoops and stuff for just still having a subjective P1. So I don't think with a new device you can get away from subjective. Now, if you use parts that are used in other devices, you might be able to get some of that data. But if it's totally new or new to you, then it's going to be quality.
Thank you.
When you come up with the RPN number and say, or below this number is acceptable, is there any thumb rule as to what's acceptable RPN number?
You notice I didn't have RPNs up there because the FDA, even though RPNs used to be like all the rave, right? And if you had an RPN of higher than 25, you had to control the risk. Well, the FDA really doesn't like the lookup table approach. They want you to really try to lower every risk as much as possible. So now we use priority or we use risk level, but there is no longer an RPN that we use to say, yeah, this is good and this is not good. And RPNs are typically used with FMEAs, right? Your severity times occurrence times detection. Where in the risk analysis at the system level, we're going to assume that a failure can occur and we're going to mitigate it regardless, right? We're going to mitigate it. That's going to have its own probability. But our RPNs typically are not, I don't think a lot of people use them because of that.
So I did notice, I had heard that, by the way, and I did notice that in your table you didn't have RPM, but you had priority, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that column in priority then is in your table, it was not the multiplication of the parameters?
It was.
Oh, it still is.
It still is, but you call it priority and if they ask you what it's for, hey, it's to prioritize my actions that I have to take. It's not where I'm saying it's acceptable or not acceptable, right? So yeah, it's still a useful thing. And the funny thing is, like I have a customer that does the weirdest thing that drives me crazy is like they estimate the unmitigated like probability of harm, and it's either high, medium, or low. And then they estimate the post-mitigated, and those are numbers. They go, it's like, how do you compare the two? It drives auditors crazy because they can't compare. So you want to have those numbers because at least it gives them something to say, oh yeah, you reduce the risk. These controls actually reduce the risk. Or these controls are really more important because it helps you reduce the risk.
Go ahead, Diego.
Talk about the analysis must be performed at the system level, even when you are a customer or a manufacturer. Because if you are a customer, probably you have a device and you don't need to perform an error more effect analysis for every level. But maybe you need to do it in order to manufacturer.
Right. Well, if you're the customer, the user of the device, you're probably not going to be performing these analyses. You're going to trust that the manufacturer did their job correctly. But what I mean at different levels is For example, FMEA, they're great, but they take a lot of time and resources to do, right? So if you have, let's say, like MRI equipment, you have these huge medical devices that have 3,000-4,000 parts. To do an FMEA and everything can take you a year or more, right? So an approach is to do like a system level FMEA, then identify the parts of the system that are critical, and then do FMEAs on those parts and drill down based on criticality, right? So that you're not doing every little screw, like looking at a screw that's not really important when you should be looking at a motor or things like that.
Mercy, thank you very much.